The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Windsor Castle as King Charles III walked slowly down the marble corridor. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, creating a rhythm that matched his troubled thoughts. Today was different from any other day in his reign. Today he would make a decision that would shock everyone in the palace, including his beloved wife Camilla. Charles had always been a man of deep thinking and careful consideration. He learned this from his mother, Queen Elizabeth, who taught him that every royal action had consequences that rippled far beyond the palace walls. But recently something had been eating away at him, something that made his usually calm demeanor crack like old paint on a weathered wall. The problem started 3 months ago during a family gathering at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Camilla's children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, had been invited along with their families. Charles had grown fond of them over the years, treating them as his own stepchildren. He welcomed them into royal events and even gave them small roles in official ceremonies. The public loved seeing this blended family come together, and it showed Charles as a modern, accepting father figure. However, that weekend in Scotland changed everything. Charles overheard a conversation that he was never meant to hear. He had been walking in the castle gardens, enjoying the crisp Highland air, when voices drifted from an open window above. Tom and Laura were talking with some friends who had joined them for the weekend. Their words cut through Charles like a sharp blade. "Honestly, it's quite brilliant how Mother managed all this," Tom had said with a laugh that sounded cruel to Charles's ears. "From mistress to queen consort, and now we get all the royal perks without any of the real responsibility. It's like winning the lottery without buying a ticket." Laura's voice joined in, equally dismissive. "Charles is so desperate to be liked by everyone. He bends over backward to include us in everything. Sometimes I wonder if he realizes we're just playing along because it benefits us. The royal connections have been amazing for my art gallery business." The friend's voice was harder to identify, but the words were clear. "Your mother really played the long game, didn't she? Waiting all those years for Diana to be out of the picture, and then swooping in when Charles was vulnerable. Quite the master plan." Charles felt his blood turn cold. He gripped the garden wall so hard his knuckles turned white. These were the children he had welcomed into his life, the ones he had grown to love as his own. He thought about all the Christmas mornings they had shared, the birthday celebrations, the quiet family dinners where he felt truly happy and content. Had it all been an act? That night Charles couldn't sleep. He walked the halls of Balmoral, his mind racing with questions and doubts. Was Camilla aware of her children's true feelings? Had she encouraged this attitude? Were they all just using him for their own gain? The man who had waited decades to become king suddenly felt like the biggest fool in the entire kingdom. When morning came, Charles made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not confront Tom and Laura directly. Instead, he would watch and wait. He would test their loyalty and see if their private words matched their public actions. But deep inside, a cold anger was growing, an anger that would soon freeze out the very people who had caused it. The return to London was tense. Camilla noticed that her husband seemed distant, but she attributed it to the stress of his royal duties. Charles had always been a man who carried the weight of the crown heavily on his shoulders. She tried to comfort him with gentle touches and soft words, but Charles pulled away. How could he look at her the same way when her children saw their marriage as nothing more than a business arrangement? Over the following weeks, Charles began to change his behavior in subtle ways. When Tom called to ask for royal patronage for a charity event he was organizing, Charles politely declined. When Laura requested use of a palace room for her art exhibition, Charles found reasons to refuse. These small rejections confused Camilla, who had grown used to her husband's generous nature toward her family. The palace staff began to notice the shift as well. Charles had always been kind to everyone, from the highest lords to the lowest kitchen staff. But now, there was a coldness in his eyes when certain names were mentioned. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, tried to understand what had changed his usually warm-hearted king into someone who seemed to be building walls around himself. Camilla's family felt the change most directly. Invitations to royal events stopped coming. Phone calls from Charles became rare and formal. The warm embraces and genuine smiles were replaced with polite nods and distant handshakes. Tom and Laura began to worry that they had somehow offended the king, but they couldn't figure out what they had done wrong. The situation reached a breaking point during a state dinner for the President of France. Camilla had assumed her children would be invited, as they had been to similar events in the past. She mentioned it casually to Charles while they were getting dressed for the evening. His response was so cold and final that it left her speechless. "Your children will not be attending tonight or any future state functions," Charles said without looking at her. "They have their own lives to live and we have ours." Camilla stared at her husband in shock. This was not the man she had married, not the stepfather who had welcomed her children with open arms. Something had fundamentally changed and she had no idea what had caused it. That night, as they stood together greeting foreign dignitaries, Camilla felt more alone than she had in years. The palace staff whispered among themselves about the king's strange behavior. Some thought he was having health problems. Others believed the stress of the crown was finally getting to him. But a few older servants who had worked in the palace for decades recognized the signs. They had seen this kind of cold silence before, during the difficult years of Charles's first marriage. It was the silence of a man who felt betrayed by the people he trusted most. Charles himself was struggling with feelings he didn't fully understand. Part of him wanted to confront Camilla about what he had heard, to give her a chance to explain or defend her children. But another part of him, the part that had been hurt so many times before, chose silence as his weapon. If Tom and Laura wanted to play games, he would show them what it meant to be on the outside of royal favor. As the weeks passed, the cold silence grew deeper and more noticeable. Palace insiders began to realize that something serious was happening within the royal family, something that would soon become impossible to hide from the public eye. Camilla stood in her private sitting room at Clarence House, staring out at the London skyline as rain droplets traced paths down the window glass. 3 weeks had passed since the state dinner incident, and her husband's behavior had only grown more puzzling and hurtful. She picked up her phone for the 5th time that morning, wanting to call her children, but then set it down again. Something told her that this situation was more serious than a simple misunderstanding. The Queen Consort had always prided herself on understanding people, especially Charles. During their long courtship and early marriage years, she had learned to read his moods like a favorite book. She knew when he was worried about environmental issues, when he was frustrated with government policies, and when he simply needed quiet time to think. But this new Charles was a stranger to her, cold and unreachable in ways that frightened her. That afternoon, Camilla decided to visit her daughter Laura at her art gallery in Chelsea. She needed to talk to someone who would understand the complexity of blending families, especially when one of those families happened to be the most famous in the world. Laura had always been her confident, practical daughter, the one who could see through problems and find solutions. The gallery was quiet when Camilla arrived. With only a few visitors studying the paintings on the white walls, Laura looked surprised to see her mother arrive unannounced, especially without any security detail. Camilla had insisted on coming alone, something that rarely happened anymore since becoming Queen Consort. "Darling, is everything all right?" Laura asked, leading her mother to a small office behind the main gallery space. "You look troubled." Camilla sat down heavily in the offered chair and looked at her daughter with tired eyes. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you or Tom done anything that might have upset Charles? Said anything that could have been misunderstood?" Laura's face showed genuine confusion. "What do you mean? We haven't even seen him properly in weeks. Every time we try to arrange a family dinner, there's always some excuse. Tom thinks Charles is just busy with royal duties, but I've been wondering if we've somehow offended him." The concern in Laura's voice seemed real, but Camilla had learned over the years that her children were skilled at hiding their true feelings when necessary. Both Tom and Laura had grown up in the public eye, dealing with media attention and public scrutiny from a young age. They had developed thick skins and the ability to present whatever face the situation required. "Think carefully," Camilla pressed. "Any conversations, any comments that might have been overheard? Charles has completely shut you both out, and I can't understand why." Laura was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "There was that weekend at Balmoral," she said slowly. "We had some friends visiting, and we were all talking about royal life and how different it is from what people imagine. But it was just casual conversation, nothing mean or disrespectful." Camilla felt a chill run down her spine. "What exactly did you say about royal life?" "Just ordinary things," Laura replied. But there was something in her voice that made Camilla pay closer attention. You know, how strange it is to suddenly be part of all this pageantry and tradition. How different our lives are now compared to before you married Charles. Nothing terrible. But even as Laura spoke, Camilla could see doubt creeping into her daughter's eyes. The kind of doubt that comes when someone realizes they might have said something they shouldn't have, in front of someone who shouldn't have heard it. Meanwhile, across London at his club, Tom Parker Bowles was having lunch with a friend from his food writing career. He had been trying to understand why his stepfather had suddenly become so distant, and he was beginning to suspect that he might know the reason. "I think I might have messed up badly," Tom confided to his friend over wine and roast beef. That weekend in Scotland, we were all talking rather freely about family dynamics. You know how it is when you're relaxed and among friends. But now I'm wondering if Charles might have overheard something he wasn't meant to hear. His friend leaned forward with interest. "What kind of things were you saying?" Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Nothing malicious, but perhaps not thoughtless. We were talking about how surreal it all is being part of the royal family through marriage rather than birth. How different the perks are from the actual responsibilities. I may have made some comments about how fortunate we've been." "That doesn't sound too terrible," his friend said, but Tom shook his head. "It's not what we said, it's how we said it. And if Charles heard it without context, without understanding that we were just letting off steam..." Tom trailed off, realizing the full implications of what might have happened. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles was in his private study, going through state papers with his usual meticulous attention to detail. But his mind kept wandering to the conversation he had overheard in Scotland. Each time he remembered Tom's laughter and Laura's casual dismissal of his efforts to include them, the anger burned a little brighter in his chest. Sir Clive Alderton knocked on the door and entered with the day's schedule. He had been Charles's private secretary for years, and had never seen his boss maintain such a sustained period of coldness toward any family member. Even during the worst days of the divorce from Diana, Charles had never completely shut people out the way he was doing now. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive said carefully, "the Queen Consort has requested a private audience with you this evening. She seems quite concerned about family matters." Charles looked up from his papers with eyes that showed no emotion. "Tell Her Majesty that I'm available for dinner at 8. We can discuss whatever concerns her then." But even as he agreed to meet with Camilla, Charles was already building his defenses. He had made his decision about Tom and Laura, and he wasn't sure that anything Camilla could say would change his mind. The hurt had gone too deep and the betrayal felt too complete. That evening, as palace staff prepared for what they sensed would be a difficult conversation between the king and queen consort, none of them realized that the entire foundation of the royal family's carefully constructed harmony was about to be shaken to its core. In the servants' quarters, the older staff members exchanged worried glances. They had seen royal marriages survive many storms, but they had also seen how silence and misunderstanding could destroy even the strongest bonds. The Cold War between Charles and Camilla's children was about to become a hot conflict that would test every relationship in the palace. As 8 o'clock approached, both Charles and Camilla prepared for a conversation that would either heal the growing rift in their family or make it permanently unbridgeable. Neither of them fully understood yet how much damage had already been done, or how difficult it would be to repair the trust that had been broken by a few careless words spoken in what they thought was privacy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths that had been hidden for too long and force everyone involved to face the real nature of their relationships with each other. The private dining room at Buckingham Palace had never felt smaller to Camilla as she sat across from her husband at exactly 8 o'clock that evening. The table, normally set for grand state dinners with dozens of guests, now held settings for just 2 people. The distance between them seemed to stretch far beyond the few feet of polished mahogany that separated their chairs. Charles arrived precisely on time, dressed in his usual evening attire, but his face wore an expression Camilla had rarely seen during their years together. It was the look of a man who had made up his mind about something important and unpleasant. The warmth that usually lit up his eyes when he saw her was completely absent, replaced by a coolness that made Camilla's heart sink. "Good evening, Camilla," Charles said formally as he took his seat. Even his voice sounded different, stripped of the affection and intimacy that usually colored their private conversations. "Charles," Camilla replied, studying his face for any sign of the man she had fallen in love with decades ago. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you've been incredibly busy." They ate the first course in silence, the only sounds coming from the gentle clink of silverware against china and the distant hum of London traffic beyond the palace walls. The chef had prepared one of Charles's favorite meals, but he barely seemed to notice what he was eating. His attention was focused somewhere else entirely, lost in thoughts that Camilla desperately wanted to understand. Finally, Camilla could bear the silence no longer. "Charles, please tell me what's wrong. This isn't like you, the way you've been, treating Tom and Laura, the distance you've put between us. I need to understand what's happened." Charles set down his fork and looked directly at her for the first time that evening. "What do you know about your children's true feelings regarding our marriage and their place in this family?" The question caught Camilla off guard. She had expected him to be upset about something related to royal duties or public appearances, not something so personal and painful. "I know they love you," she said slowly. "They've always been grateful for how you welcomed them into your life." "Grateful," Charles repeated, and there was something bitter in the way he said the word. "Yes, I'm sure they are quite grateful for all the benefits that come with being connected to the royal family." Camilla felt a cold fear growing in her stomach. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Charles reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. Camilla stared at it in confusion until Charles pressed the play button. Suddenly, the dining room was filled with the voices of her children, recorded during that weekend at Balmoral. Tom's laughter echoed off the walls as he spoke about winning the lottery without buying a ticket. Laura's voice followed, dismissing Charles's efforts to include them as the desperate actions of a man who wanted to be liked. As the recording played, Camilla watched the blood drain from her husband's face. She realized that he had been carrying this pain for weeks, listening to these words over and over again, letting them poison his feelings toward her entire family. When Tom's friend made the comment about her playing the long game and waiting for Diana to be out of the picture, Camilla saw Charles flinch as if he had been physically struck. "Charles," she whispered when the recording ended. "Where did you get this?" "I was walking in the gardens that morning," Charles said quietly. "I heard every word they said. I heard how they really feel about me, about us, about everything I thought we had built together." Camilla felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She could see how much this had hurt him, how deeply the betrayal had cut into his heart. But she also knew her children well enough to understand that they had been speaking carelessly. Probably showing off for their friends rather than expressing their deepest feelings. "They didn't mean it the way it sounded," she said desperately. "You know how young people talk when they're trying to impress their friends. They say things they don't really mean." "Don't they?" Charles asked, and his voice was colder than Camilla had ever heard it. "Because it sounded quite genuine to me. It sounded like they had been discussing this among themselves for some time." Camilla reached across the table, trying to take his hand, but Charles pulled away from her touch. "Please don't do that," he said. "I need to know something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you know how they really felt? Have you been part of this charade?" The question hit Camilla like a physical blow. "How can you ask me that? How can you think I would be part of some conspiracy against you? I love you, Charles. I've loved you for decades through all the difficulties and challenges. That has never been fake. But you must have known something," Charles pressed. "Children don't develop these attitudes in isolation. They must have heard you say something, or seen something in your behavior that made them think it was acceptable to view our marriage as a business arrangement." Camilla stood up from the table, her hands shaking with emotion. "I have never ever spoken about you or our marriage in anything but loving terms. If my children said those things, they said them on their own, without any encouragement from me." But even as she defended herself, Camilla began to remember conversations she had with Tom and Laura over the years. Times when she had mentioned how different her life was now, how fortunate they all were to be part of such an important family. Had she somehow given them the impression that the marriage was more about status than love? Charles watched his wife's face carefully, seeing the doubt and confusion there. Part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the hurt was too deep, and the words on the recording were too clear. Whether Camilla had encouraged these attitudes or not, her children had revealed their true feelings about him and their place in his life. "I need time to think," Charles said finally. "I need to decide how to move forward from here." "What does that mean?" Camilla asked, fear evident in her voice. "It means that your children are no longer welcome at royal events," Charles said with finality. "It means that I will not be providing them with any further assistance or support through royal connections. They have made it clear that they view their relationship with me as a business arrangement, so I am terminating that arrangement." Camilla sank back into her chair, stunned by the harshness of his decision. "You're punishing them for a private conversation they never meant for you to hear. I'm protecting myself from people who have been taking advantage of my generosity while mocking me behind my back," Charles replied. "And I'm protecting the dignity of the crown from those who see it as nothing more than a convenient connection to exploit." The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla realized that her husband had already made his decision, probably weeks ago when he first heard that recording. This conversation wasn't about finding a solution or healing the hurt. It was about informing her of what he had already decided to do. "And what about us?" she asked quietly. "What about our marriage?" Charles looked at her with eyes that showed both love and pain. "That depends on whether you can accept my decision about your children, and whether you can convince me that you truly had no part in their attitude toward me." As the evening ended and they went their separate ways to bed, both Charles and Camilla knew that their marriage had been fundamentally changed by this conversation. The trust between them had been damaged, perhaps beyond repair, and the family they had worked so hard to blend together was now broken into pieces that might never fit back together again. The morning after the devastating dinner conversation, Camilla woke up in her bedroom at Clarence's house feeling as though she had aged 10 years overnight. She had barely slept, her mind racing through every possible way to repair the damage that had been done to her family. The empty space beside her in the bed reminded her that Charles had chosen to spend the night at Buckingham Palace, something he rarely did when they were both in London. She picked up her phone and stared at Tom's number for several minutes before finally pressing call. Her son answered on the second ring, his voice cheerful and unsuspecting of the storm that was about to hit their family. "Morning, Mum," Tom said warmly.
"How are you?"
"I was just thinking about calling you to see if you and Charles wanted to join us for lunch this weekend. Emma's been asking when she'll see her step-grandfather again." The mention of his daughter Emma, Charles's step-granddaughter, made Camilla's heart break even more. Charles had always been wonderful with Emma, treating her like his own grandchild and spoiling her with attention and gifts. Now that relationship was in jeopardy because of careless words spoken by adults who should have known better. "Tom," Camilla said, her voice serious enough to immediately change her son's tone, "I need you and Laura to come see me today. We need to talk about something very important." "Is everything all right?" Tom asked, concern creeping into his voice. "You sound upset. Just come, please. Both of you, as soon as possible." 2 hours later, Tom and Laura sat in their mother's sitting room, both looking worried and confused. Camilla had spent the time preparing herself for what might be the most difficult conversation she had ever had with her children. She loved them deeply, but she also loved Charles, and she could see that she might be forced to choose between them. "I need to play something for you," Camilla said without any preliminary explanation. She pressed play on the same recorder Charles had used the night before, and watched as her children's faces changed from confusion to understanding to horror as they heard their own voices filling the room. When the recording ended, the silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Tom was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh God," he said, putting his head in his hands. "He heard all of that." Laura looked pale and shaken. "Mom, we didn't mean..." "It wasn't. We were just talking nonsense with friends. You know how conversations go when you're relaxed and showing off a bit. But you did mean some of it," Camilla said quietly. "I can hear it in your voices. The way you talked about Charles, about our marriage, about your place in this family. Some of those feelings are real, aren't they?" Tom and Laura exchanged glances, both realizing there was no point in trying to completely deny what they had said. They had been caught expressing thoughts they probably should have kept to themselves. but thoughts that had some basis in their actual feelings. "It's complicated, Mum," Tom said finally. "Of course we're grateful for everything Charles has done for us. Of course we care about him. But it's also true that our lives changed dramatically when you married him, and not all of those changes feel entirely natural." Laura nodded in agreement. "It's like we're playing roles sometimes. The loving stepchildren, the grateful family members who are just so happy to be part of the royal world. And most of the time we are happy. But sometimes it feels like performance art." Camilla listened to her children with growing sadness. She could understand their feelings, even sympathize with them to some extent. Being part of the royal family was indeed like living in a constant performance, where every action was scrutinized and every relationship was public property. But understanding their feelings didn't make Charles's hurt any less real or justified. "Charles feels completely betrayed," she told them. "He opened his heart to you both, welcomed you into his life and his family, and now he believes it was all fake on your part." "It wasn't fake," Laura protested. "Maybe we were being thoughtless and stupid in how we talked about it. But our affection for Charles is real. Our gratitude is real. But so is your sense that you're playing a role," Camilla pointed out. "And so is your awareness of the benefits that come with being connected to the royal family." "Charles heard all of that in your voices." Tom stood up and began pacing the room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "What does he want from us? How do we fix this?" "I don't know if we can fix it," Camilla admitted. "Charles has decided that you're both no longer welcome at royal events. He's cutting off all support and assistance. He feels like you've been taking advantage of his generosity while mocking him behind his back." Laura started to cry, not the dramatic tears of someone trying to manipulate a situation, but the genuine tears of someone who realized they had lost something important through their own carelessness. "We never mocked him, Mum. We were just processing our feelings about this strange life we found ourselves in." "I know," Camilla said gently, "but Charles doesn't see it that way, and I can't entirely blame him." The three of them sat in the quiet room, each lost in their own thoughts about how to move forward from this devastating situation. Finally, Tom spoke up with a suggestion that surprised both women. "Maybe we should step back voluntarily," he said. "Maybe we should remove ourselves from royal events and connections for a while. Show Charles that we understand how much we've hurt him." Laura looked at her brother in surprise. "You want us to basically exile ourselves from the family?" "I want us to take responsibility for our actions," Tom replied. "We said things that were hurtful and disrespectful, even if we didn't mean them the way they sounded. Maybe if we show that we understand the consequences of our words, Charles might eventually forgive us." Camilla felt a mixture of pride and sadness at her son's suggestion. It showed maturity and genuine remorse, but it also meant that her family was voluntarily splitting apart just when she needed them most. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, Charles was meeting with his private secretary and closest advisors. Word of the family rift was beginning to spread through the palace staff, and there were concerns about how to handle the public relations aspects of the situation. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive said carefully, "if Tom and Laura suddenly stop appearing at royal events, people will notice. There will be questions about what happened to cause such an obvious change in family dynamics." Charles had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was necessary. "We'll simply say that they've chosen to focus on their private careers and personal lives. It's not uncommon for extended family members to step back from royal duties." But even as he said the words, Charles knew that the situation was more complicated than a simple public relations problem. The hurt he felt was real and deep, but he was also beginning to wonder if he had reacted too harshly. The recording of Tom and Laura's conversation played in his mind constantly, but he was starting to hear different nuances in their words each time he listened to it. As the day wore on, Charles found himself questioning not just Tom and Laura's motivations, but his own response to their careless words. Had he allowed his past hurts and insecurities to color his interpretation of what he had heard? Was he being fair to punish them so severely for a private conversation they never intended him to hear? The questions swirled in his mind as he went through his royal duties, but he pushed them aside. He had made his decision and he would stick to it. The royal family had been hurt enough by people who pretended to care while secretly pursuing their own agendas. He would not allow himself to be vulnerable to that kind of betrayal again, even if it meant sacrificing relationships that had brought him genuine happiness. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation, and the atmosphere in the royal household had become so tense that even the newest staff members could feel it. Camilla moved through her daily duties like someone walking through thick fog, performing her role as queen consort with professional competence, but none of the warmth and energy that had made her so popular with the public. Charles, meanwhile, had thrown himself into his royal duties with an intensity that worried his closest advisors. He worked from early morning until late evening, accepting every invitation and scheduling extra meetings to avoid having time to think about the growing distance between him and his wife. But the strategy wasn't working. Every quiet moment brought back the memory of that recording and the pain of feeling betrayed by people he had grown to love. The situation reached a crisis point when Princess Anne, Charles's sister, decided to intervene. Anne had always been known for her direct approach to family problems, and she could see that her brother was destroying his marriage over something that might be fixable with honest communication. She arrived at Buckingham Palace unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, walking past surprised staff members who were used to more formal protocols when royal family members visited each other. Anne found Charles in his study, surrounded by papers and looking exhausted. "You look terrible," Anne said without any polite preliminaries, settling into the chair across from his desk. "And from what I hear, you're acting terrible too." Charles looked up from his work with surprise and annoyance. "I don't recall asking for your opinion on my personal life, Anne." "Well, you're getting it anyway," Anne replied firmly. "I've been hearing whispers throughout the palace about how you've banished Camilla's children and how you're barely speaking to your own wife. This needs to stop before you do permanent damage to your marriage." "They brought this on themselves," Charles said, but there was less conviction in his voice than there had been weeks earlier. "You didn't hear what they said about me, about Camilla, about our marriage?" Anne leaned forward with interest. "No, I didn't. But I'm hearing it secondhand from palace staff who are worried about you. So why don't you tell me exactly what happened?" Charles hesitated for a moment, then played the recording for his sister. Anne listened without interruption, her face showing various emotions as she heard Tom and Laura's careless words. When it ended, she sat back and considered what she had heard. "Well," Anne said finally, "they were certainly being thoughtless and disrespectful. But Charles, they weren't plotting against you or deliberately trying to hurt you. They were having a private conversation where they were processing their complicated feelings about being part of this family." "Processing?" Charles repeated angrily. "They were mocking me and everything I've tried to do for them." "They were being young and stupid," Anne corrected. "There's a difference. Do you remember some of the things we said about royal life when we were their age? About the pressures and the strange situations we found ourselves in? We weren't always perfectly grateful and gracious about our circumstances." Charles was quiet for a moment, thinking about his sister's words. It was true that he and his siblings had often complained about royal life when they were younger, sometimes in ways that would have hurt their parents if they had overheard. But that seemed different to him, because they had been born into the royal family rather than choosing to join it. "This is different," he said finally. "They chose to be part of this family when Camilla and I married. They should have been more respectful. Or maybe," Anne suggested gently, "they should have been allowed to be human. Charles, you've always had impossibly high standards for yourself and everyone around you. Sometimes people need to be able to express their doubts and frustrations without being punished for it." That evening, Charles decided to take a walk through Hyde Park, something he rarely did without a full security detail. He needed time to think away from the palace walls and the constant reminders of his royal duties. As he walked, he found himself remembering not just the hurtful words on the recording, but also the good times he had shared with Tom and Laura over the years. He remembered teaching Tom about organic farming at Highgrove, and how genuinely interested his stepson had seemed in sustainable agriculture. He thought about Laura's excitement when he had arranged for her to meet famous artists at gallery openings, and how she had written him thoughtful thank you notes afterward. Were those moments fake too? Or had they been real expressions of affection and gratitude? As Charles walked deeper into the park, he encountered a young family having a picnic. The children were laughing and playing while their parents watched with obvious love and amusement. The scene reminded him of family gatherings at Balmoral, when Tom and Laura would bring their own children to visit. He had treasured those moments, feeling like he was finally part of a normal, loving family rather than just a royal figurehead. The memory of little Emma calling him Grandpa Charles and climbing onto his lap to hear stories suddenly brought tears to his eyes. Had that affection been coached by her parents? Or had it been the natural response of a child who felt loved and secure in his presence? The thought that he might never have that relationship with Emma again because of his reaction to her parents' careless words made him feel sick. Charles returned to the palace that evening feeling more confused than ever. His anger toward Tom and Laura was still real, but it was now mixed with doubt about whether his response had been proportionate to their offense. He thought about Camilla, who had been living in a kind of emotional exile for weeks while he sorted through his feelings. She deserved better than the cold treatment he had been giving her. Meanwhile, at Clarence's house, Camilla was having her own difficult evening. She had spent the day fulfilling royal engagements, smiling and making small talk while her personal life fell apart around her. The strain was beginning to show, and several people had commented on how tired she looked. The press was starting to speculate about problems in the royal marriage, though they didn't yet know the specific details. Tom and Laura had been trying to respect their mother's need for space while dealing with their own guilt and regret about the situation they had created. Tom had written several drafts of letters to Charles apologizing for his words and trying to explain what he had really meant. But each draft seemed inadequate to address the hurt he had caused, and he was afraid that any attempt at communication would only make things worse. Laura had thrown herself into her work at the gallery, but she found it difficult to concentrate on art when her family was in crisis. She kept thinking about all the times Charles had gone out of his way to support her career, introducing her to collectors and artists who had helped her business grow. The idea that he now viewed all of those gestures as wasted effort on ungrateful recipients made her feel ashamed and heartbroken. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Emma, Tom's 8-year-old daughter, asked her father why she hadn't seen Grandpa Charles lately. Tom tried to give her a vague explanation about everyone being busy, but Emma was persistent in the way that only children can be. "Did I do something wrong?" Emma asked, her young face showing genuine worry. "Is Grandpa Charles mad at me?" The question hit Tom like a physical blow. He realized that his careless words weren't just affecting his own relationship with Charles, but were also hurting innocent children who had no part in the adult conflicts. Emma loved Charles and looked forward to their visits together. She didn't understand why that relationship had suddenly disappeared from her life. That night, Tom called his mother and asked if he could speak with Charles. "I need to apologize properly," he said. "Not just for what Laura and I said, but for not thinking about how our words might hurt him if he heard them. And I need to make sure Emma doesn't lose her grandfather because of my stupidity." Camilla felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. "I'll ask him," she promised. "But Tom, you need to understand that this has really hurt him. He felt like you and Laura were using him while secretly laughing at his efforts to include you in the family." "I know," Tom said quietly, "and maybe there was some truth to that feeling even though we didn't mean it maliciously. Maybe we did take his kindness for granted, but I want the chance to make it right if he'll let me." The next morning, Camilla approached Charles with Tom's request. They were having breakfast together for the first time in days, a small step toward normal relations that gave her courage to raise the difficult subject. "Tom wants to speak with you," she said carefully. "He wants to apologize properly and explain what he really meant." Charles was quiet for a long moment, stirring his tea while he considered the request. Part of him wanted to refuse, to maintain the wall he had built around his hurt feelings. But another part of him, the part that remembered Emma's laughter and Tom's genuine interest in environmental causes, wanted to hear what his stepson had to say. "One conversation," Charles said finally, "but I make no promises about forgiveness or restoration of family relationships. He hurt me deeply, Camilla. Both of them did." "I understand," Camilla said, relief evident in her voice. "Just hearing him out would mean everything to all of us." As preparations were made for what could be either a healing conversation or a final goodbye between Charles and Tom, the entire royal household held its breath. Everyone could sense that the future of the family hung in the balance, waiting to see whether pride and hurt would triumph over love and forgiveness. The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday afternoon in Charles's private study at Clarence's house. The choice of location was significant. Not the formal grandeur of Buckingham Palace, but the more intimate space where Charles often retreated when he needed to think or have personal conversations. Tom arrived precisely on time, looking nervous but determined to face whatever consequences awaited him. Charles was already seated behind his desk when Tom entered, and the younger man was struck by how much older his stepfather looked. The past month of tension and hurt had taken a visible toll on the king, adding lines to his face and a weariness to his posture that hadn't been there before. Tom realized with a sharp pang of guilt that he had contributed to this suffering. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Tom began, remaining standing until Charles gestured for him to take a seat. "I know you didn't have to, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you." Charles studied his stepson's face carefully, looking for any signs of insincerity or manipulation. What he saw instead was genuine remorse and something that looked like real emotional pain. Tom's usual confidence and easy charm were nowhere to be seen, replaced by the demeanor of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "You wanted to apologize?" Charles said simply. "I'm listening." Tom took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I want to start by saying that there's no excuse for what Laura and I said that weekend. We were careless and thoughtless, and we said things that were hurtful and disrespectful. But more than that, we said things that weren't entirely true to how we really feel about you and our place in this family." "Weren't they?" Charles asked, his voice still cool but showing the first hint of real engagement. "Because they sounded quite honest to me. People are usually most truthful when they think no one is listening." Tom winced at the accuracy of that observation. "You're right that we were speaking freely, without thinking about how our words might sound to someone else. But Charles, when people vent about their lives, they often focus on the frustrations and complications rather than the good things. It's like when someone complains about their job. They're not usually talking about the parts they enjoy or find meaningful." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Are you comparing being part of this family to having an unpleasant job?" "No," Tom said quickly, then paused and reconsidered. "Actually, maybe in some ways, yes. Not because we don't want to be here, but because it is complicated and sometimes stressful to suddenly be part of something as public and scrutinized as the royal family. We were processing those complications, but we did it in a way that made it sound like we didn't appreciate or care about the good parts." For the first time since Tom had arrived, Charles looked genuinely interested in what he was saying. "What are the good parts from your perspective?" Tom seemed surprised by the question, as if he had expected to spend the entire conversation defending himself rather than explaining his genuine feelings. "The good parts are having you as a father figure when I never really had one growing up. The good parts are watching Emma light up when she sees you, and knowing that she has a grandfather who genuinely cares about her. The good parts are being included in events and traditions that are important to you, and feeling like we're actually part of something bigger than ourselves." Charles felt something shift in his chest as Tom spoke. These words had a different quality than the conversation he had overheard, more thoughtful and less performative. But he still wasn't ready to let his guard down completely. "Then why?" Charles asked. "Did you and Laura talk about my efforts to include you as if they were signs of desperation? Why did you laugh about winning the lottery without buying a ticket?" Tom looked down at his hands, clearly struggling with how to explain something that he himself didn't fully understand. "I think we were trying to process the surreal nature of our situation by making jokes about it. One day we were ordinary people living ordinary lives, and then suddenly we were part of the most famous family in the world. That's overwhelming, and sometimes when things are overwhelming, people make jokes to cope with them. But the jokes came at my expense," Charles pointed out. "And at the expense of the marriage that means everything to me." "You're absolutely right," Tom agreed immediately. "And that's what I'm most sorry about. We were so focused on our own adjustment to this life that we didn't think about how our words might sound to you if you heard them. We didn't consider that joking about your kindness might make you question whether our gratitude and affection are real." Charles was quiet for several minutes, processing what Tom had said. The explanation made sense in a way that the original conversation hadn't. He could understand how young people might use humor and casual cynicism to deal with circumstances that were genuinely difficult to navigate. But understanding didn't automatically heal the hurt. "What about the comments about your mother playing the long game?" Charles asked. "About waiting for Diana to be out of the picture?" Tom's face showed genuine pain at this question. "That was our friend who said that, not us. And it was cruel and unfair. Laura and I should have shut that down immediately, but we didn't. And that makes us complicit in saying something truly hurtful about both you and Mom." "Yes, it does," Charles agreed quietly. "Charles, Tom said, his voice becoming more urgent. "I need you to know that Mum had absolutely nothing to do with our conversation that day. She's never spoken about you or your marriage in anything but loving terms. If we gave the impression that we learned to be cynical about your relationship from her, that's completely false." This was something Charles had been particularly worried about, and hearing Tom's emphatic defense of Camilla provided some relief. But there were still questions that needed to be addressed. "How do I know," Charles asked, "that this conversation we're having now isn't just another performance? How do I know that you're not telling me what you think I want to hear, so that you can get back into royal favor?" Tom considered the question seriously before answering. "I suppose you don't know that for certain, but I can tell you that losing your respect and affection has been one of the most painful experiences of my adult life. I can tell you that Emma asks about you constantly and doesn't understand why her grandfather has disappeared from her life. I can tell you that Laura cried when she realized how much we had hurt you." He paused, then continued with obvious emotion in his voice. "And I can tell you that if you never want to see us again, if you never want us at another royal event or family gathering, Laura and I will accept that decision. But we couldn't live with ourselves if we didn't at least try to make you understand that our careless words don't reflect the genuine love and respect we have for you." Charles found himself moved by Tom's obvious sincerity, but he was still struggling with how to move forward. The hurt had been real and deep, and it wasn't something that could be erased with a single conversation, no matter how heartfelt. "I need time to think about this," Charles said finally. "I appreciate your apology, and I believe that you're sincere. But trust once broken takes time to rebuild." Tom nodded, looking both hopeful and realistic about the challenges ahead. "I understand. And Charles, whether you decide to forgive us or not, I want you to know that you've been a wonderful stepfather and grandfather. That's not performance or manipulation, that's just the truth." As Tom left the study, both men felt emotionally drained but also somehow lighter than they had in weeks. The conversation hadn't solved everything, but it had opened a door that had been firmly closed. Whether that door would lead to reconciliation or simply to a more civilized form of distance remained to be seen. 2 months after the conversation between Charles and Tom, the royal family found itself in a delicate state of healing that was both hopeful and fragile. Charles had spent weeks thinking about everything his stepson had said, weighing Tom's explanations against his own hurt feelings and trying to determine the best path forward for everyone involved. The first sign of progress came when Charles quietly asked Camilla about Emma's upcoming birthday. His 8-year-old step-granddaughter had been an innocent victim of the family conflict, and Charles found that his love for her was stronger than his anger toward her parents. When Camilla told him that Emma had been asking why Grandpa Charles wasn't coming to her party, his heart broke a little more. "I think," Charles said carefully to his wife one evening, "that I should at least send Emma a birthday gift. She shouldn't suffer because of the mistakes her parents made." Camilla felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. It was the first crack in the wall Charles had built around his heart, the first sign that forgiveness might be possible. "She would love that," she said softly. "She misses you terribly." The gift Charles chose was significant, a first edition of a children's book about environmental conservation, something that reflected both his own passions and his genuine care for Emma's education and interests. He wrote a personal note inside the cover, telling Emma that he was thinking of her and hoped she was taking good care of the small garden they had planted together at Highgrove the previous spring. When Emma received the book and read the note aloud to her parents, Tom felt emotions he couldn't quite name. The fact that Charles remembered their shared garden project, that he cared enough to send something meaningful rather than just expensive, showed a depth of feeling that went far beyond obligation or public relations. Laura, meanwhile, had been going through her own process of reflection and change. She had written Charles a letter that she never sent, pouring out her feelings about the conversation he had overheard, and her genuine regret about the pain it had caused. Writing the letter had helped her understand her own emotions better, even if she never found the courage to share it with him. The real turning point came during a chance encounter at a charity event in London. Charles was attending a gala for one of his environmental organizations when he spotted Laura across the crowded room. She was there with a client from her gallery, discussing a piece of art that would be auctioned for the charity. For a moment their eyes met across the room, and Charles saw something in Laura's expression that reminded him of the young woman who had nervously joined his family years earlier. Instead, of looking away or leaving the event early as he might have done weeks before. Charles found himself walking over to where Laura stood. The conversation that followed was brief and somewhat awkward, but it was civil and even showed glimpses of their former warmth. "The painting you're donating is beautiful," Charles said, looking at the landscape that Laura had selected for the auction. "It reminds me of the views from Balmoral." Laura seemed surprised that he had approached her, but pleased that he was engaging with her work rather than simply acknowledging her presence out of politeness. "That's exactly what drew me to it," she said. "The artist spent time in Scotland, and I thought you might appreciate the connection to the land you love so much." It was a small conversation, lasting only a few minutes, but it felt like a tentative step toward normal relations. Charles didn't invite Laura to any upcoming events, and she didn't ask about when the family might be together again. But they spoke to each other like people who cared about each other's opinions, rather than like strangers forced together by circumstances. Word of the encounter reached Tom within hours, as news travels quickly in the interconnected world of London society. He felt cautiously optimistic that perhaps Charles was beginning to soften his position, but he was careful not to read too much into a single conversation. The real test came when Princess William and Catherine announced their upcoming wedding anniversary celebration. It would be a family gathering at Windsor Castle, and the question of whether Tom and Laura would be invited hung heavily over everyone involved. Camilla didn't want to pressure Charles, but she also didn't want to attend a family celebration that excluded her children. Charles spent days wrestling with the decision. His rational mind told him that Tom and Laura had apologized sincerely, and that their offense, while hurtful, didn't warrant permanent exile from the family. His emotional side still felt raw from their betrayal, and wasn't ready to pretend that everything was back to normal. The solution came from an unexpected source. Emma, who had been carefully coached by her parents, sent Charles a handwritten thank you note for his birthday gift. In her childish handwriting, she asked if Grandpa Charles would like to see the garden they had planted together, because it was growing beautifully, and she thought he would be proud of how well she was taking care of it. The innocent request from his step-granddaughter finally broke, through Charles's remaining resistance. He realized that his anger toward Tom and Laura was preventing him from maintaining a relationship with Emma, and that seemed both unfair and counterproductive. Children needed stability and love, not adults who held grudges that affected family bonds. Charles called Tom that evening, surprising his stepson with the unexpected phone call. "Emma tells me the garden is thriving," Charles said without any preliminary greeting. "It is," Tom replied, his voice careful but hopeful. "She's been incredibly dedicated to it. She talks about the things you taught her almost every day." "I'd like to see it," Charles said, "and I'd like to see her. Would this Saturday afternoon be convenient?" The visit to see Emma's garden became the foundation for slowly rebuilding family relationships. Charles spent an hour with his step-granddaughter, admiring her gardening efforts and listening to her chatter about school and friends. Tom and Laura were present but kept their distance, allowing Charles and Emma to reconnect without any pressure or awkwardness. As Charles prepared to leave that afternoon, he found himself face to face with both Tom and Laura. The three adults looked at each other for a moment, all of them aware that this was a pivotal moment in their relationship. "Thank you for coming," Tom said simply. "Emma has missed you more than you know." "And I've missed her," Charles replied. Then, after a pause, he added, "I've missed all of you despite everything that happened." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. Over the following weeks, Charles gradually began including Tom and Laura in family events again, though the relationships remained somewhat formal and careful. Trust was being rebuilt slowly, with everyone aware that it would take time to fully heal the wounds that had been created. Camilla watched this gradual healing with relief and gratitude. Her marriage to Charles had survived a crisis that could have destroyed it, and her family was slowly coming back together. The experience had taught everyone involved valuable lessons about the importance of careful communication and the power of forgiveness. The palace staff, who had watched the family drama unfold with concern, began to relax as they saw normal interactions returning. The cold silence that had dominated the royal household for months was replaced by cautious but genuine warmth. Charles himself had learned something important about the nature of family, relationships, and the difference between thoughtless words, and deliberate cruelty. While he never forgot the pain of that overheard conversation, he came to understand that loving someone means accepting their imperfections and forgiving their mistakes when they show genuine remorse. The story that had begun with betrayal and cold silence ended with the quiet triumph of love over pride and the recognition that families are worth fighting for, even when they disappoint us. The royal family emerged from their crisis stronger and more honest with each other, having learned that even kings and queens must sometimes choose between being right and being loving.